Welcoming Davis. It's a pleasure to have you here. And for the viewers, for those of you who don't know Davis, Davis is the co-founder of Resilience, and they're practically redefining how companies think of cyber insurance and risk management. They work with some of the most enviable logos out there. But I'll defer an introduction to what Resilience does to Davis himself. He can explain it a lot better.
Aayush, thank you very much for having me. So we started Resilience back in 2016, initially as a data provider to insurance companies. And we had this thesis that, what was really needed out in the market was not necessarily another, security widget or network scanner, but really something that could help fundamentally change the economics of cybersecurity. And that's where we got interested in some of the behavioral change capabilities of the insurance market. I mean, you look at insurance, and it's the reason why we have seatbelts in cars. It's the reason why you don't see massive fires burning down cities anywhere, because you have modern safety standards. You have modern building code standards. Cybersecurity doesn't have that. And when we looked at what was really needed, we see that, there's such a complex risk landscape and threat landscape out there. We wanted to provide the capability to combine the analytics, bringing in what companies need to do to improve their cyber hygiene, with a model that also not only benefited them, but also benefited the business when everybody grew together.
This is a bit of a cheeky question, but I still take the liberty to ask this, right? So for the longest time, we've seen a lot of companies use cyber insurance as a way to transfer risks. I mean, a lot of risks would actually get transferred there. But we've seen the discourse change over the last couple of years, right? Insurance premiums have become more expensive, and insurance companies are a lot more fastidious in terms of checking the health of controls while they're underwriting it. So how do you see that evolving? What's driving that change really? And how should companies be prepared for it better?
That's a great question, Aayush. And I think one of the core things that we see companies now finally starting to think about is that when you manage risk, right, you have several different ways to do it. You can try and mitigate it, security controls. You can avoid it, not doing risky behavior, but every business is now an online business, so you can't really avoid cyber risk. And then also transferring it too. But those things don't happen in a vacuum. Like, you can't just transfer all of your cyber risk away to an insurance company and not do any of the good cyber hygiene. And what we saw specifically in 2019 was a shift in the maturity of the cyber insurance market, where traditionally the product had worked to transfer the risk of data breach liability and lawsuits. As we saw the rise of tactics like ransomware as a service, insurance companies started seeing massive losses from ransomware claims, clients that were being forced to pay the extortions with no other recourse, unprepared for dealing with the type of extortions that advanced criminals were throwing at even mid-sized companies, right? And so the market underwent a fundamental shift where a lot of the insurance product really started to mature and focus on this idea of how do you not just stop a data breach, but how can you build a more resilient company? And that's really the thesis for our offering, is that we work with our clients ahead of their policy, during their policy, and throughout the life cycle of a claim to ensure that we're not just transferring some of their risk, but in fact, we're sharing that risk with them. And we're alerting them when issues come up that might lead to a claim. And then we're educating them on what we learn is most effective at reducing the cost of an incident. And without quantifying that risk, without actively working and investing specifically against what's unique to your organization, and then without also that risk transfer piece, you don't really get that holistic cyber risk and cyber resilience package. And so this is what we've seen be most effective with our clients today.
Got it. And if I may ask this question a little further, right, as a follow-on. So we see information security controls and best practices increasingly become a part of the board discourse. Right? It's something that probably didn't happen not 5 years ago. But as we also just discussed, right, that getting cyber insurance also is not a silver bullet. It's becoming more expensive. It's becoming harder, right? And insurance companies expect, while they're underwriting, they expect companies to have certain hygiene controls in place, right? But if you also think about it, the market is inundated with a variety of acronyms and tools in the cyberspace, and that's how the space has evolved over the last few years, right? How do we make it simple? How do we ensure that there is no duplication of effort? Because there are a bunch of controls that an insurance company would expect from a company, and then there are a bunch of controls that, let's say, a SOC 2 would mandate or an ISO would mandate, right? And You've been instrumental in developing some of the NIST controls as well, right? So even the NIST 800 controls would mandate, right? How do we tie it all together and make it reasonably simple for a non-technical or a non-infosec individual or team to really get a hang of, and not get lost in the jargon?
Yeah, well, I joined the insurance industry when we started the startup, and I got to say, I moved from one industry, public sector and cybersecurity, that has tons of acronyms, to another sector with tons of acronyms and control frameworks and regulation. And it can, for any security,
Acronym soup is real.
yeah, acronym soup. That's absolutely right. No better way to describe it. And we did a lot early on as founders to get to know the industry. We were lucky that the cyber insurance industry is actually such a tight family. Met some amazing people that were working actually within the cyber insurance industry to help simplify this problem and drive better solutions for their clients. We ended up hiring a lot of those people when we launched our own insurance company, which I have the pleasure of working with them now. But one of the core issues that we've all kind of felt on the insurance side and the security side is that this issue, cyber risk, is finally getting the executive level attention that for the longest time we felt it served. So for security leaders, this issue is incredibly complex. Not only do you have human adversaries that are changing threat tactics all the time, changing their targets, which industries they're really going after, but you also have regulations from your own industry. You have varying control frameworks or requirements from vendors, and you have insurance companies asking their own list of questions, right? And so what we're seeing now with the increased focus from the SEC is that at the board level, you also have senior executives asking more and more, what are we doing about this risk? How are we measuring it? How are we managing it? How do we show our maturity, right? And what we find is most effective is that if you look at right now today, we tend to take a compliance-driven risk approach. But what we really need is a risk-driven compliance. So for companies to think about what is core and what is most impactful to their ability to deliver value to their clients, and then working from that set of security measures and investments, which may not be technical controls. Yeah, it might be governance and instant response planning, training, identity access management policies, right? Understanding how well you're doing implementing and regularly practicing this sort of blocking and tackling work can then layer up to these different compliance and control frameworks. And then you can report up to your board with a structure that can align you back to, hey, we are SOC 2 compliant. Hey, we are working our way through HIPAA compliance. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a framework that we're using for reporting out to the board, right? But I think if you're coming at it from just saying, how do I pass a SOC 2 audit? That's the wrong way to think about it.
Got it. And just talk to us a little about, what kind of a journey have you had prior to starting Resilience that led you to come in touch with the problem and eventually fall in love with it?
Yeah. So when we started in the U.S. government, I was lucky enough to be there sort of right at the genesis of a lot of our awakening around critical infrastructure and the larger cyber risks that these faced. And so from the start, I've always thought about cybersecurity risk more holistically. How do you think about an all hazards approach? How do you think about maintaining availability in operations? One of the big things that we learned, after the Stuxnet revelations, just largely as a society, that a lot of the critical infrastructure that runs our daily lives is just as vulnerable as we saw in that case. And in order to protect it, doesn't require just buying the right cybersecurity tool, but it requires a whole process to secure it. And you have to do these across all these different sectors like rail, food, health, education. The pandemic has shown us, a lot of times how fragile supply chains are, right? And when we think about cybersecurity, digital risk sort of cuts across not only all of these different industries, but all these different types of threats. Breakdown in communications can, completely take down a business. We saw this with Colonial Pipeline, where, a lot of their business systems were impacted, but that took the whole business down, right? And it threatened distribution of energy across the eastern seaboard. This data plane, this digital connectivity really matters to business operations. And so this is what drove a lot of our thinking that when we were looking to start our own company, we couldn't just build another widget. We had to build something that could fundamentally shift the economics of cyber risk and help organizations think through how do you connect those silos in your company that can actually drive real change and make your company more resilient to cyber risk.
So let me actually shift gears a bit, right? Because a lot of the people listening to this podcast are going to be younger founders, fellow founders, for whom having a journey like Resilience has had is going to be quite aspirational, right? So would really love to understand if you could just walk us through the kind of thoughts you had, right, when you were venturing into building a business. Did you get the problem statement right front? Did you have to pivot? What were the iterations you had to go through? What did that feel like? Just trying to make it real for our listeners. Would love for you to love for you to talk about that.
I mean, I'm going to be vulnerable, Aayush, with you. There was a time early on.
I
My wife is a big fan of the TV show Silicon Valley on HBO. And one night she was holding my hand and she was like, "Your palms are getting sweaty." And I'm like, "Babe, sweetie, I can't watch this anymore." It was just too close to real life. So,
which part though? Which part, if I may ask? Which part?
I'll never say. But, we made it past it. And I think, for any founder, right, you have to, the most important thing is pick co-founders that you can rely on, you can trust, which I'm very lucky to have my co-founders who have always had my back. And secondly, to continue going until you can't. Make it a major part of your life and give as much to it as you can. And, no matter what the outcome, you won't have failed. I will say too, the classic startup problems, it is amazing, despite, how many books there are, how many blogs there are, amazing resources out there, how many warnings they'll give you, just how easy it is to fall into some of those pitfalls. We had a very early classic case of listening to our users more than our buyers early on. When we were an analytics company, we were developing very advanced cybersecurity analytics for insurance companies. And we had some wonderful people that were longtime thought leaders in the cyber insurance space say that this is exactly what they wanted. But when it came to, with the larger contracts, we initially had problems getting traction or getting past procurement. And that's because the larger business didn't need another cyber risk rating tool. They needed something that was going to make their business better. And as soon as we put the analytics in light of how can these cybersecurity analytics make their business processes better, how can we scale the expertise of some of their expert underwriters, and how could we start to pass on some of the security benefits to their clients, all real business use cases, that's when we started to hit. And that's when we started to get some of the major first contracts that we did that really told us here that we were onto something bigger.
That's a very interesting point that you mentioned, drawing a clear distinction between your users and your buyers, right? And actually take the liberty to pick on that, Davis. So in the initial stages, when you had to really evangelize to your buyers, the decision makers on why there should be a budget allocation towards the problem, what is in it for them, right? What were some of the challenges you faced during that evangelization process? And what did you get right? What did you get wrong? How did you navigate the initial few customers there?
Yeah, well, I was used to coming from a politics background where you're constantly trying to make your case and evangelize things. And, I think one of the big things early on that I was lucky to have some mentors teach me was that, it's really more about listening and it's more about empathy. And it's about understanding how to craft a solution for the real day-to-day problems that your users face and bring the solution into a larger business context. And so, learning that love for your users, getting in there, we had I got to run the customer success team for a while and, went out to Connecticut in February during the middle of a snowstorm and sat with an underwriting team to understand, what was the hardest part, what slowed them down, the most, and, really getting to listen to these people and hear their day-to-day lives. That was the best part about a startup, honestly, because you came back from that with, with books full of notes and so inspired that, in just a few months, you could turn around something that was going to dramatically affect these people's day-to-day lives and make it better.
And you mentioned, earlier in the conversation that you also teach a course at UC Berkeley, right, which is about cybersecurity risk management. So I'm actually curious to understand who's the target audience for that class. What's the class profile look like, and which part of your experiences are you, most keen on sharing with your students?
Yeah. So UC Berkeley did something really interesting. Around 10 years ago, they looked at data scientists, and they saw that data scientists were a significantly lower supply than the demand for them. And a lot of data science roles required a PhD. So they thought, how can we build a same type of data science capability, but in a faster and easier degree, a master's program? So they built this master's in data science in the School of Information. When they looked at the cybersecurity field, they saw the same thing. They saw, in order to be a real cybersecurity expert, there is years and years and years of practical work, hands-on work that you have to do. How can we put this into a master's degree, focus that education, and start producing leaders quickly? And so when they established the program, I got lucky enough to work with one of my colleagues from Palo Alto Networks, who was then the CISO at Nutanix. And we looked and we saw that there was a gap in the cybersecurity profession, just what we had talked about earlier, going from the technical controls and understanding those investments and communicating that up to senior decision makers. So we decided to build a class that was focused on building CISOs and building out that squishy part of understanding risk, making judgments about that risk, and then communicating that narrative across your organization. And so we've been running this class since 2018. We've had some wonderful students come through. The CISO at Proofpoint, Lucia Milka, is one of our former students. We have a number of students who have gone on to senior leadership roles. And it's been wonderful to see, this level of risk assessment along with a narrative storytelling and then larger business skills actually be so effective at producing real leaders in the cybersecurity field.
That's actually a very interesting point that you bring up, Davis, because being a CISO it's a very aspirational thing today, because it's over the years it's become one of those cooler roles, right, that people want to get into. But it's also equally intimidating, and that intimidation sort of acts as a barrier for really smart people to get into, right? So they find it hard to cross that hurdle in their minds. So what would your advice be to young professionals in terms of how they can break into cybersecurity and even eventually work their way up to being CISOs? Is it acquiring technical skills? Is it acquiring better communication skills? Is it acquiring, where do they start? Do they start as being internal auditors, for example? You could potentially start as a NIST auditor and then work your way up to becoming a CISO. So what do you think the entry points could be? Or maybe there's no straight answer. It really depends on what's your core strength and where you've come from, right? So, but I just want to sort of break it down, demystify it a bit, and make it less intimidating for people wanting to break into this role.
No, that is a great question, and I get that from my students all the time.
Yeah, and guessing that your class would also have a very eclectic mix of people from various kinds of backgrounds, right? So how do we sort of demystify it and make it simple?
Yeah, that's one of the great things about having this class at Berkeley. Actually, the security profession benefits the most from diversity of experience, diversity of skill set. I myself came from a political science background, and I was building and breaking computers when I was young, but I never had any real technical training until I got into this field. I will say that in order to be able to converse in the security field, you have to do some technical training. So you can't just come at it without actually getting in there, trying to set up network taps, deploy your own firewalls. That type of work is instrumental. So anybody getting started definitely should take intro to ethical hacking, penetration testing, security concepts, and actually work with their computer to set up some of these tools. But at a higher level, I think there's always going to be chasing another certification, right? And this profession has set up so many different certifications. It's great for people that are curious because you'll always be learning. But one of the bigger things that I work with my students on is being able to assess risk holistically. So not just follow the checklist, but take that checklist, understand and shape it to what's critical to your organization that you're in charge of defending. It's different for every organization. And then communicate that to folks that have not done the level of technical training that you have. So not just doing the FUD approach, we call it, which is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So trying to walk away from FUD and focus on empowering. So saying security shouldn't just be a cost center, but really security is going to help us buy down some of this risk so that we don't have to avoid it. So we can lean head into it. So we can launch that new product. So we can expand into that new region, right? So we can double the team and grow the business. That's where we need to be thinking as security leaders about how do we communicate the importance of what we're doing back to the business side that's responsible for revenue, it's responsible for operations, because at the end of the day, right, whether or not you're in public sector or whether or not you're in private sector, you're all responsible to the citizens or the customers or the clients and delivering value back to them.
And so if I had to sort of draw a distinction between CISOs at mid-market companies and CISOs at large enterprises, right? And the reason why it's probably important to characterize the two groups separately is because a large enterprise CISO typically would be adequately instrumented with various heads across different problem statements, right? So there would be a GRC head, and even within GRC, there would perhaps be a separate team managing external audits, a separate team managing risks, then a separate cloud sec team, separate pen testing team. And so that's a very well-instrumented, well-resourced kind of a setup. But if you're talking about mid-market companies, where you typically see a CISO or a VP of information security or a head of GRC managing a 3 to 4 member team and looking across problem statements, GRC is a problem statement, cloud security is a problem statement, compliance with various standards. And if you're a fintech company, for example, if you're a mid-market fintech company, you have to comply with a PCI DSS, which is more verticalized as compared to, let's say, an ISO or a SOC 2, right? And we've seen companies, some of our customers have to comply with 15, 16 different standards, right? So the acronym soup has intensified, and then there are multiple tool categories, right? I wouldn't actually name any of them here, but so the acronym soup is real. The tool fatigue is real, right? How do we keep it simple and effective? I mean, where does a mid-market CISO really focus on? Is it focused? And you also at some part, at some time during the conversation, you alluded to some very basic elementary controls, like access controls, for example, right? Or employee training, for example. You mentioned that phishing simulations is an important component of how employees, what kind of training content employees should be imparted, right? So what would you consider as the 4 or 5 very fundamental pieces that a mid-market CISO should focus on? And again, just, at the cost of repeating myself, a mid-market CISO typically is operating with thinner budgets, is operating with a smaller team, is not as instrumented or resourced as a very large company CISO would, right? And chances are they're operating with a very frugal cybersecurity budget in general, but the cost of a breach is actually monumental for a mid-market company. They can't get away with buying expensive insurance, right? It's probably going to impact business continuity. So what are the 4 or 5 fundamental things that a mid-market CISO should really be focusing on?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, we deal with pretty much strictly mid-market companies at Resilience, and we really see sort of 2 different ends of the spectrum. We see, the larger mid-market entities approaching like $1 billion in revenue, really almost large enterprises where they've sort of just grown up. They've got a lot of resources. They need to prepare to be a large company. And so they're just trying to piece all these things together. And then we see other companies that are on the lower end, around 300 million in revenue to 500 million or so. And here is where they're doing same compliance requirements as you noted, like maybe a fintech company or a regional bank. But it's literally like they all have single points of failure. There's very small teams operating. And, when we look at both of them, sort of the initial guidance that we give them is similar. And the first part is, sort of taking a step back and, looking at, rather than saying, okay, which framework do we have to dive into first, coming back and saying, what keeps our business growing every day? And having everybody sort of understand that from an executive team level. Because when you only have a few points of failure within a company, the CISO can't do it alone, right? So a lot of what we do initially with customers when we're talking to them is connecting the different silos, not breaking the silos because everybody needs their own expertise, but connecting the silos of the risk manager that thinks about, how do I buy insurance to ensure that we survive our worst day, to the CFO, who, half of the CFO's role is investing against risk. The other half is growing revenue. And then the CISO, whose job it is to be that domain expert in cybersecurity. Having alignment between them about what keeps the company growing, what delivers value to the customers. and then starting to quantify the level of impact that could knock a company out. And so this is where I think actually some of the recent advancements that the industry has looked at, doing cyber risk quantification, doing some modeling, even like, so dare I say statistics, right? A lot of people don't like to hear the statistics word, but doing some of that modeling, which is within the capability of a lot of like technical folks, to understand what's your probability of loss, what's the probability of having a $5 million incident over the next 3 years. As you start to understand that, then you can start to think about, like I talked about at the beginning, risk mitigation, risk acceptance, and risk transfer. And this is a conversation that you can have with non-technical executives. So as you have your team of finance, risk, and security, they can then talk about probabilities of loss up to the CEO, up to the board. And you can start to understand a risk tolerance for the business. After you have that risk tolerance, then the pieces sort of fit down in line. And then you can say, okay, for our, fintech company, we do business with, in New York State. So we need to meet NYDFS standards, right? Or for our telehealth company, we need to meet HIPAA standards. And we also need to comply with California Privacy Act. And so from there, you can think about, okay, these different standards we have to meet are part of our overall risk. And so we have to do them. But then there's other things like, we store a bunch of customer data. It may not be a best practice to do this, but we should probably keep it encrypted at rest. And by the way, as we back that data up, because other companies in our industry are getting hit by ransomware, how do we ensure that if we do get hit by ransomware, we aren't in the position of having to pay an extortion? Well, one of the best ways to do that is to practice restoring from backup, so that if you are hit by ransomware, you can shorten the amount of recovery time. Because what we see actually is that one of the core drivers of people paying extortions is they realize that their business interruption costs are going to be significantly higher than the ransom payment, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that could have an existential impact, unlike a large company where they'll probably just pay fine and get away with it, right?
That's exactly right. But then from there, right, then you can get to the different controls you're talking about. You can get to how do we implement the identity access management program, which can deploy tools like MFA, which keeps out ransomware actors or keeps them from accessing backups, right? But it all starts with risk. It doesn't start with compliance, right? You really have to understand your risk tolerance.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that for a mid-market company or any company for that matter, having the controls talk to the risks instead of controls artificially having been created to talk to requirements within frameworks is a better approach, because those controls are realistic. They talk to the reality on ground. Those controls will incidentally and inevitably make a company compliant with the NIST 800s and the SOC 2s. And even, by the way, the frameworks also allow a fair degree of flexibility in terms of defining a statement of applicability, defining what controls. Not a lot of people are aware of it, by the way, but your SOC 2 report would look very different from my SOC 2 report, depending on what controls are most applicable for you. So I think the standards themselves do allow a fair degree of flexibility, do allow a fair degree of realism in terms of, talking to the situation on ground. So I think starting with risk assessment is something that companies should do more often, instead of just having to create an artifact called the risk register for the external auditor's consumption. And in fact, one of the things that we're seeing across companies that we work with, Davis, is that companies that are operating with a much leaner budget, a leaner cybersecurity budget, are the ones that have the strongest degree of control implementation in place, right? Both from a control design as well as effectiveness point of view, because they simply can't spend money on fluff, right? Whereas if you do have a very fat cybersecurity budget to spend, chances are you would end up accumulating a lot of acronyms, but you'll be strengthening certain parts of your overall infra or assets, but some parts of it will be left in a very weak state, right? So I think some bit of frugality forces people to, and we've seen this across many companies, particularly mid-market companies, that some bit of frugality actually forces behavior, which is very fundamental in nature. They're fixing very fundamental things, getting the right things in place, and buying more tools only incrementally, where they actually hit a wall or hit a bottleneck, right? So this is very interesting, and I'll actually just, and this is, I'll probably make this the last question, Davis, but cybersecurity is a hot space. And this is something that, the the swings in valuations notwithstanding, the general market sentiment notwithstanding, right? This is a space which is here to stay. It's been around for a while. It's going to stay for a while because attackers are getting smarter and attackers don't understand bureaucracy. They are going to keep getting smarter, right? So they don't have to take approvals to breach our environment, right? So now for our peers, for other founders starting up in this space, right? How do they? And it's also like there are glitzy acronyms out there. It's very easy to get enamored by acronyms and jargon, right? So how should and you've been through this journey and you've been through this journey very successfully. So how should founders starting up in cybersecurity or information security or cyber risk in general think about what ideas to prioritize, what problem statements to work on, what is really fundamental, right? And how should they sort of create a balance between creating something that's, let's say, category creating, but it's also hard to fathom. The buyer wouldn't fathom what you're doing because one of the things you mentioned earlier on was, going through a fair degree of evangelization upfront to make your buyer see the value in what your user is seeing, right? So how do founders starting up in the space create a balance between that? And how should they think about what problem statements to really run after?
Yeah, great questions. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see in the security innovation space is often you'll have a very cool solution that's in search of a problem, right? And I think the biggest trends in IT are actually the ones that should be driving where we look to solve security problems. So, move into the cloud from hybrid models to full cloud models. The communication, trusted communication, of certainly like the new threats from generative AI leading to larger scale impersonation attacks or spear phishing. These are the areas that are real challenges that don't have clear solutions. And if you're starting off as a founder and you're thinking like, where can I bring to market this solution? It is significantly less likely that you're going to be at the right time, at the right maturity level, and speaking to the right person to hit that solution with the best go-to-market and scale that. It is much better to approach a real problem that impassions you and is going to keep you driven to keep working that problem until you find it. And this is what drove us and what really connected us as co-founders is that we had seen that there was this bigger disconnect between people buying technological solutions and the larger business need of companies to address their cyber risk. There was nothing connecting those. And we looked around and we thought, what is this space? And we worked on this problem a lot until we started to see like, hey, that there's an opportunity for a new economic model and a new category to be created for this idea of cyber resilience, which connects the economics of risk through risk transfer back through the actual technical implementation of it. And that's been such an amazing and I think rewarding journey, attacking the problem and then figuring out what solutions we put together to solve it, rather than if we had just approached it and said, hey, what can we do with this novel technology?
There's one final question that I have for you. While you were trying to figure out how to make what you're selling fly with your core user group, as well as the people who had the money, the people who would write the checks, the core buyer group, right? What is the hackiest thing you've ever done to navigate that form? What is the hackiest thing you've ever done to make your buyer feel convinced about spending money on what are you trying to sell them?
Good question. Insurance is a very relationship-driven business. People underwrite deals based on not just what the assessment says, but also some of the guarantees the company is actually following through on what they say in their application, and that trust comes from the broker relationship. So underwriters and brokers and the market for that risk is something that I hadn't really fully appreciated. And I remember early on, I started to learn that you can't just call up people in insurance and ask them to tell you what their problems are, right? Like you actually have to go and meet them in person. So I remember in the early days, my daughter was 6 months old, and my wife was a saint because I was on a plane to New York like every other week, meeting with these luminaries in cyber insurance market who now are running major programs at Fortune 100 insurance companies, getting for a quick coffee go to New York for, 3 coffee meetings, and all of those meetings would be amazingly insightful. And then I'd come around and turn that and talk to my co-founder and say, hey, can we build a screen that looks like this? And then get a quick mock-up and prototype, and then call them back and say, hey, does this screen look like what we talked about? That quick iteration was something that really started to garner the imagination of the people in the insurance industry, that it's an industry that doesn't have a whole lot of innovation in it, and I think it suffers from legacy technology. So I think from their side, seeing founders that wanted to get to know them, wanted to solve their problems, could turn around results quickly, that was one of the biggest early advantages that we had going for us.
All right, that's super helpful. Okay, so I have no further questions.